Okay, so we are here together to go ahead and record some notes over what we've been talking about since we've started this new year together, 2023. So the last couple of days we've actually been working on dividing with fractions. So we're going to take some notes that may help us when we get ready to do some problem solving the rest of this week and even next week. So I would encourage you to make sure that you have everything that I have written down in your notes so that if you need to go back and reference it, you have this information available. So let's go ahead and start by giving ourselves a title. Our title is Dividing with Fractions. So when we divide with fractions, there's a couple of things I want you to always remember, and it's really particularly involves dividing with any kind of number that we're talking about. Whenever you're dividing, you always want to make sure that you start with your total when you're dividing first. Oh, I picked up a pen that doesn't work, so let me pick up another one. Total. Your total always comes first. And the reason why I want you to remember that is because sometimes when we look at our total, when we look at the information that's been provided, it's not always the bigger number anymore. It's really what is it that we have and what is it that we're doing with that information? What is it that we're dividing or separating or even sharing? So we're going to go ahead and write those notes. So total divided by the group will give me the each, or total divided by each will give me the group. And those are just some basic rules for dividing. I'm just going to write that down. Basic rules. So that applies to whole numbers, that applies to decimals as well, and even when we think about fractions. So now let's go ahead and take our notebook paper, and just to kind of give us an imaginary line down the middle, I'm going to go ahead and fold my notebook paper in half. That kind of gives me an imaginary boundary line. And the first thing that I want to write down on the left-hand side is separating into equal sets. That is what we talked about on Tuesday when we came back together. So I'm going to go ahead and write that down, separating into equal sets. And if at any time I'm going a little too fast, just feel free to pause the video and catch up. So the next thing I want to write down is, well, what does that mean? Well, in the stories that we were looking at on Tuesday, we always had 3 cups, or we had 3 tablespoons, or we had 3 teaspoons. We had 3 of something that we were separating. So I'm going to go ahead and use that number as my model. And I'm going to kind of reference back to the first problem that we did together, the experience with the Play-Doh. We had 3 cups. And we wanted to separate those cups into 1/2 servings. And then we wanted to know how many 1/2 servings there were. So what did we do with our Play-Doh? Well, the first thing that we had to do was take our Play-Doh and we made 3 groups. Whether we made 3 piles or we made 3 rectangles, whatever it was, we made 3 of something. And then we also represented that with our drawing. Now remember, boys and girls, we can't give you Play-Doh on a test or on the STAR test or when we're taking a computer test, but you are always allowed to draw pictures. And then when I think about having the number 3, because that is my total, I cut those 3 models in half equally. So I'm going to take my pencil and I'm going to cut it in half. And basically what I want to know is how many 1/2 servings you see in front of you. So I'm going to label those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's how we get the number 6. Now remember, we get a larger number, but we have to always remember that these pieces are now smaller. So even though our number is larger than the number we started with, these are much smaller pieces. So we would call these 6 1/2 sized pieces. And it's kind of important when we're working with fractions and dividing that we really make sure that we're labeling and understanding that. So what I'm going to give you, what I want you to write down next are a few steps that are going to help you when you think about, well, how do I separate? What am I going to do when I don't have that Play-Doh in front of me? What am I going to do when Mrs. Cartwright and Mrs. Barlow aren't here to help me? Well, I can reference my notes. So here are some steps that I think might be helpful. So the first thing that we did is we were drawing, you draw your total. That's the first thing. Draw your total, which I drew the 3 pictures. The next thing that we did is we partitioned, or we cut, and I like to use that word partition because you may see that word again. We partitioned into equal pieces. And that's cutting it into those fractional pieces. Remember, when we cut, they need to be equal in size. And then the last thing that we did is we just count the pieces. Count the equal pieces. Okay? I'm sorry, that should be a D. My finger or my hand was writing a little faster than what I needed to write down. Okay? So those are the steps for separating into equal sets. I'm going to go ahead and move over to the other side now. And the action that we were talking about yesterday was called sharing a set equally. So I'm going to go ahead and put that over here. Now, honestly, boys and girls, you know, separating and sharing, they sometimes seem very similar, but they are very different when we write them out. So sharing a set equally, because we're going to get a totally different answer. Totally different answer. All right, so if I go back and I think about, well, what were we doing yesterday? I'm going to go back to the ribbon problem, because that's the one I think about first. That was the first experience question we did. So we had 1/2 of a foot of ribbon that we wanted to divide into 3 equal pieces. So what is it that we're wanting to cut? Well, we're wanting to cut the ribbon, and I have to think about what is that total amount that I have. Well, I started with 1/2 foot. And I was going to divide that 1/2 foot into 3 equal pieces. So I've got the same numbers here, but it means something totally different now. Because I don't have 3 feet, I only have 1/2 of a foot. And so what I needed to do was find out, well, what is the length of each one of those pieces? So just like before, what did we do? Well, we started with our whole amount. And for the purposes of this video, I thought it would be easy if you just take a sticky and we use that as our whole. So this sticky represents 1 whole. But when I think about the story, we did not have a whole piece. We only had 1/2 of that piece. So I have to partition my whole into 1/2. And then we covered and we looked at this this half piece that we had. And we had to think, well, if I had a half, what was I going to do with it? I was going to cut it, divide it, partition it into 3 equal pieces. So that's where I cut it with my pencil, or maybe I used a knife to cut my Play-Doh yesterday. But when I uncover, I see that my picture isn't equally divided. And remember, in order to be able to get a fraction name, we have to have equal pieces. So what do we have to do? Well, we have to partition both sides. So we have to carry over our dividing lines. And then when I think about my answer, I think about only getting one of these pieces, because my question was asking me about one of the lengths of the piece of ribbon. And so whenever I look at this to label it, I think, well, what is the part that is shaded? The part is 1. And how many total pieces are represented? There are 6. So my answer is 1/6. And so just like before on this side, we wrote down some steps that were helpful. We're going to do that on the following side. So I'm going to move my camera so you can see this a little bit easier. And we just have 4 little steps that we're going to write down that are going to help us remember what to do. So let me write my little title here. We have steps for dividing or sharing a set equally. And the first thing that we did is we always started with a whole. If you were using Play-Doh yesterday, we always started with a whole piece. And then we partitioned the total. So since I only had a half, I partitioned it in half. And from there, we partitioned again. Kind of makes me think of that cross shading that we did when we used decimals. Partitioned again, the sharing portion. And then when we were looking for our answer, well, our answer is one part of the total pieces. Okay. All right, boys and girls. So there are just some things I want you to remember about dividing. So we have some great notes that are going to help us. And if you haven't started Priyanka's Picnic, then you're going to be doing that next. And make sure that you have all of these notes. You are accountable for having these notes in your notebook.